The night they wheeled me into the emergency room, I was alone. Not the kind of alone where you wish someone was there. The kind where you already know no one is coming, and that knowing settles into your chest like cold water. My name is James. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years driving a city bus for the Transit Authority in Cleveland, Ohio. I raised 2 kids in a house I bought with my own hands, painted every room myself, fixed the roof twice, planted a garden in the backyard that my wife, Sandra, loved more than anything in this world. She passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer. After that, it was just me in the house and the memory of everything we built together, and my son Kevin, and my daughter Tanya. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I was not a perfect father. I worked long hours. There were school plays I missed. There were phone calls I was too tired to make, but I was there. I showed up. I paid for Kevin's 2 years of community college and the rest of the money he needed to transfer to Ohio State. I co-signed the loan on Tanya's first car when her credit was too thin. When her marriage fell apart, she moved back into my house for 14 months, and I never once made her feel like a burden. Not once. I tell you this not to make myself into something I'm not. I tell you this because what came next made me question every single thing I'd ever given. It was a Tuesday in February. I remember because the Browns had just had one of their press conferences, the one where they announced the new offensive coordinator, and I had it on in the background while I was making dinner. Pork chops. Collard greens. I do the same meal every other Tuesday because Sandra used to make it, and I learned her recipe, and I don't want to forget it. I slipped on a patch of ice on the back steps going out to check the gate latch. I heard something crack before I felt it. That's the thing nobody tells you about breaking bones at my age. The sound comes first, then the cold of the concrete against your cheek. Then, slowly, the pain arrives like it's been waiting just around the corner. I lay there for what felt like 30 minutes. Might have been 10. It was 22 degrees. My left hip was shattered. Fractured in 3 places, they told me later. My left wrist had a hairline fracture. I'd hit the back of my head on the bottom step. Not enough for a brain bleed, but enough for a concussion that made the fluorescent lights in the ER feel like something personal against me. The neighbor's dog started barking. Mrs. Okafor next door. God bless that woman. She heard it and looked out her window and saw me on the ground and called 911. I didn't even know she'd seen me until the paramedics were already there. I was in and out in the ambulance. I remember one of them asking me who to call. I gave them Kevin's number, then Tanya's. When I woke up the next morning in a hospital room, neither of them was there. A nurse named Angela, young woman, maybe 28, with box braids and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She was the one who told me my son had called the hospital. He called to check on your status, she said, carefully, the way people say things when they're leaving something out. Did he say he was coming? I asked. She adjusted my IV line and said, he asked about your condition and your projected length of stay. That's what she said. Projected length of stay. I stared at the ceiling for a long time after she left. Tanya called me directly 2 days in. I was sitting up a little by then, still on heavy pain medication, my hip immobilized. She called and I answered, and the first thing she said was, Daddy, are you going to be okay? And I said yes, I thought so, and told her what the orthopedic surgeon had said, that I'd need surgery to pin the hip, then 6 to 8 weeks of inpatient rehabilitation, then probably another 3 to 4 months before I'd be fully mobile again. There was a pause. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. That's what they're saying. Another pause. Then, Daddy, I really can't take that kind of time off work right now. My manager already has it out for me and I can't be flying back and forth to Cleveland. You understand that, right? I said I understood. I did not understand. Kevin called the following day. His call was shorter. He asked if I had a case manager at the hospital who could help arrange my discharge. I told him they hadn't even done the surgery yet. He said, "Oh, right. And then his voice dropped a little, and he said something I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. He said, "Well, you've got good insurance at least. The union plan, right? So you should be covered." That was it. That was the whole point of the call. He wanted to know if my medical bills were going to become his problem. I said yes. The union plan covered most of it. He said, "Good. Good. Okay. Well, let me know if anything changes." I never told either of them that I cried that night, not from the pain, from something else entirely, a grief that doesn't have a clean name. The recognition that you have poured your whole life into something that does not hold you the same way. The surgery went well. Angela was on duty the morning after, and she brought me a cup of coffee without me asking. It was hospital coffee, thin and burnt, but it was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in days. I thanked her, and she said, "Mr. James, you've got people coming to see you today?" I told her probably not. She didn't say anything. She just set the coffee down and squeezed my hand once and left. The rehabilitation unit was on the 4th floor. I spent 6 weeks there, 6 weeks of learning to walk again, of physical therapists pushing me harder than I thought I could go, of roommates who came and went, of watching the window and the snow outside turning to gray slush and then to something that almost looked like March. Kevin did not visit once. Tanya came for 1 weekend, 5 weeks in. She stayed at a hotel. She's always had a thing about hospital smells, and she visited for maybe 4 hours total over 2 days. She brought flowers. She was on her phone a lot. On the second day, she sat down across from me and folded her hands in that way she has, and she said, "Daddy, we need to talk about what happens after." I thought she meant my recovery. She did not mean my recovery. She meant the house. "Kevin and I were talking," she said, "and I want you to notice that phrase. Kevin and I were talking, because it means the two of them had this conversation without me before she flew out here, had already decided things, and this visit was partly about delivering a conclusion. We think it might make sense, given everything, to think about whether the house still makes sense for you." I asked her what she meant. "It's a lot of house for one person," she said, "and the upkeep. You saw what happened. The ice on the steps. What if Mrs. Okafor hadn't seen you?" "I've lived in that house for 27 years, I said. "I know, Daddy, but Kevin and I think it might be time to consider your options, and I mean the market in Cleveland right now." She stopped herself. "But not before I heard it. Not before I heard the market in Cleveland right now." She recovered smoothly. She said she just wanted me to be safe. She said Kevin felt the same way. She said they weren't trying to push me into anything, just wanted me to start thinking about it. I told her I'd think about it. I watched her drive away from my window the next afternoon, and I thought about my wife. I thought about Sandra painting the kitchen yellow, when everyone said yellow was too bright for a kitchen. I thought about the backyard and the garden and the address that was sewn into 27 years of my life. And then I started thinking very clearly for the first time since I'd fallen on those steps. I asked Angela one afternoon if she could help me make a phone call. Not to my children, to a man named Robert Osei, my attorney. I'd used him for Sandra's estate, for the will I'd made years ago, for the transfer of the house deed when I'd refinanced. He's a good man. Careful. Thorough. He told me once, years ago, that if anything ever changed, I should call him before I called anyone else. I called him. He came to the rehabilitation unit on a Thursday, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than my first car. He sat down, crossed his legs, took out a legal pad and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the calls, about the projected length of stay, about the market in Cleveland right now, about the 4 hours and the hotel and the phone that didn't put itself down. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he uncrossed his legs and said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He nodded slowly. He made some notes. He said he could have the paperwork ready within the week. "What I want you to understand is that I did not do what I did out of anger. Anger is hot and fast, and it burns itself out. What I felt was something quieter and much more permanent. It was clarity. The kind of clarity you get when you stop hoping people will be something they've already shown you they're not. The will I had made after Sandra died had left everything equally between Kevin and Tanya. The house, the retirement accounts, the savings, all of it, split down the middle. I had it changed. The house, Sandra's house, the yellow kitchen, the garden. I left to a nonprofit called Habitat Cleveland, a local affiliate that builds and repairs homes for working families. I'd done a few volunteer Saturdays with them years back, before my knees got bad. They do good work. The bulk of my retirement savings I restructured into a charitable remainder trust, with the Cleveland Public Library as the primary beneficiary. Sandra had been a librarian for 16 years, and there is no version of justice in my mind that doesn't include her name attached to something that lasts. To Kevin and Tanya, I left one thing each. For Kevin, the toolbox that had been my father's. Real tools, good ones. Snap-on and Craftsman. The kind you can't find at hardware stores anymore. My father used those tools to fix things his whole life. I thought Kevin might finally learn what that means. For Tanya, a framed photograph of her mother, the one from our anniversary trip to Myrtle Beach in 1997, Sandra in a yellow sundress laughing at something just outside the frame. They were not small things. But they were not the house. They were not the accounts. Robert also drew up a power of attorney, carefully worded, precisely limited, that allowed me to authorize the listing of the house while I was still in the rehabilitation unit. A real estate agent named Connie, who Robert had worked with before, came to meet me one afternoon. We signed what needed to be signed. She listed it at $385, which was on the lower end of what the market would bear. Because I wanted it sold to a family, not an investor. She showed it twice. The second family made an offer at $370. I accepted. Closing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. By the time I was discharged from the rehabilitation unit, the process was already underway. I did not tell my children any of this. A neighbor of mine, a man named Franklin, who lives 3 doors down and has known me since Kevin was in middle school, offered to let me stay in his spare room while I finished my recovery. I stayed there 7 weeks. It was a small room with a twin bed and a window that looked out at his driveway, and it was one of the most peaceful places I have ever slept. Franklin doesn't ask a lot of questions. He makes good coffee. In the evenings we watched the news and sometimes basketball. He fed me better than I fed myself. I used that time to close accounts, change beneficiaries, redirect automatic deposits, all the unglamorous administrative labor of rearranging a life. It is not dramatic work, but it is thorough. And thorough was what I needed to be. The closing on the house happened on a Thursday. I wasn't there in person. Connie and Robert handled it. That evening, Franklin and I sat on his front porch, and he poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass and handed it to me and said, "You good?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." We didn't say much else. We didn't need to. Kevin called me 8 days after the closing. I had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet building in Shaker Heights, a nice complex, well-maintained elevator access since I was still using a cane. The second bedroom I set up as a small study with Sandra's books and a comfortable chair and a reading lamp that I like very much. Kevin called and I let it ring twice before I answered. "Daddy," he said. He sounded strange, careful in a way he hadn't been before. "Hey, I wanted to check in. We've been talking, me and Tanya, and we feel bad about not being more present when you were in the hospital. I want you to know that." I told him I appreciated that. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Are you back home?" I told him I'd moved. "Moved?" His voice shifted. "What do you mean, moved?" "Moved." His voice shifted. "What do you mean, moved? What happened to the house?" I told him I sold it. The silence was long enough that I could hear him breathing. "You pee." He stopped, started again. "You sold it. When? Why didn't you? How did you sell it? Without another stop?" "Daddy, that house was." He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was going to say. That house was going to be ours. That house was part of what he'd been calculating when he called to ask about my insurance coverage. That house was what Tanya had been gesturing at when she said the market in Cleveland right now. "You're settled?" he said finally. His voice was flat now. I told him I was more than settled. I told him I was comfortable and taken care of and that I had everything I needed. He asked where I was living. I told him Shaker Heights. He asked which building. I told him a building with good security and a front desk that checks people in. I said it gently, but I said it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you serious right now?" I told him I was very serious. I told him I was very serious. I told him I loved him. I told him that would never change, but I also told him that I had done a lot of thinking in that rehabilitation unit, 4 floors up, watching the snow, and that some things had become very clear to me. "What things?" he said. "That I spent a long time making sure you and your sister had everything you needed," I said. "And when I needed something, I didn't need much, Kevin. I just needed someone to come. You called to ask about my insurance." Another silence. "Daddy, I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. "I'm just clear now. I know what I'm working with, and I made arrangements accordingly." He hung up not long after that. Tanya's call came 3 hours later. I could tell she'd been crying. Her voice was tight and high in the way it gets when she's trying not to fall apart. "Daddy," Kevin told me. "About the house." I said yes. "And he said the will was changed? Did you change your will?" I said I had. "Daddy." Her voice broke on that word, just that one word. And I want to tell you that it was hard to hear. I want to be honest about that. She is still my daughter. That is not a thing that changes. I sat in my chair in my new apartment and I held the phone and I let her cry for a minute. "I don't understand," she said. "What did we do? What did we do wrong?" And I took a breath and I said, "Baby, you didn't do anything wrong. You did exactly what you chose to do. You made your choices clear, and I made mine." "But Daddy, you came for 1 weekend," I said. "In 6 weeks, 4 hours. And the first thing you wanted to talk about was the house." I paused. "I need you to hear me. I'm not punishing you, but I am making decisions that are right for me and for what I want my life, and what's left after my life, to stand for." She asked if she could come see me. I said not yet. I said maybe someday if things were different. I said I needed time. She was still crying when we said goodbye. I've been in this apartment for 4 months now. In the mornings I make coffee and sit by the window, which faces east, and I watch the light come up over the neighborhood. There's a park across the street. People walk dogs there. Families on the weekends. I've watched the seasons begin to shift. From the winter I fell down my steps into something warmer, something with more color in it. I still use the cane. The hip is healing. I do my exercises every day. Physical therapist orders, and I can feel myself getting stronger. Slowly, the way recovery actually works, without fanfare. One day slightly better than the last. Franklin comes by on Sundays. We watch football when there's football to watch, and basketball when there isn't. And sometimes we just sit and don't watch anything at all. Mrs. O'Coffer sent me a card when she heard I'd moved. She said she missed seeing my garden. I wrote her back and told her I planned to put some containers on the balcony in the spring, tomatoes and marigolds. Nothing elaborate. The library named a small reading room after Sandra. Robert handled the paperwork for the donation. It's in the children's section. They put her name on a plaque by the door. When they told me, I drove over. I'm driving again, short distances, carefully. And I stood in the doorway of that room and looked at the little chairs and the books on the low shelves in the afternoon light coming through the windows, and I thought about her, about how she used to read to the kids when they were small, doing different voices for each character, making Kevin laugh until he fell off the couch, about how she believed, genuinely and without irony, that a book given at the right moment could change the direction of a person's life. I think she was right. I stood there for a long time, Then I went home. I am not going to tell you that I don't miss my children. I do. I miss who they were when they were young, and I miss who I thought they were becoming, and sometimes I miss the idea of a family that pulls toward each other instead of apart. That grief is real, and I won't dress it up as something else. But I am 64 years old, and I have learned, later than I would have liked, that love is not the same as debt. That being someone's father does not obligate me to fund their indifference. That every morning I wake up in a place that is mine, that is quiet, that no one can come to claim. Every one of those mornings is a form of grace. I did not lay on those concrete steps in the cold and survive to hand my life over to people who see me as an asset to be managed. I lay on those steps in the cold and survived so that I could decide, clearly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what I was doing, what my life was worth, and what it was for. The toolbox is in Kevin's garage. He called to confirm he'd received it. He didn't say much. I told him my father built things with those tools. I told him the best thing I could wish for him was that he'd learn to build something too. He didn't answer. Maybe someday he will. I have a cup of coffee and a window facing east and Sandra's name on a wall full of children's books. That's enough. That's more than enough. I've been sitting with a story long enough now that I can tell it without my voice going unsteady. It took a while. What I keep coming back to is something I didn't fully understand until I was lying in that rehabilitation unit, 4 floors up, watching the snow outside turn gray. I keep coming back to the idea that the way we raise our children is a kind of contract, not a legal one, not written down anywhere, but real nonetheless. And like any contract, both sides have to hold up their end. For 30 years I held up mine. I worked. I showed up. I gave Kevin and Tanya everything I could stretch myself to give. And somewhere in that giving, I think I made a mistake that had nothing to do with love. I gave without ever letting them feel the weight of receiving. I never let them wonder. I never let them want. And so they grew up not knowing what it cost to care for someone, because I'd made sure they never had to find out. That's not a judgment. It's just what I see clearly now from where I'm sitting. There's a thing that happens when you live long enough and go through enough. You stop mistaking motion for direction. Kevin and Tanya were always moving, always busy, always working, always something. But when the moment came that actually required them to choose, really choose, between their own comfort and their father lying in a hospital bed, the motion stopped. And what was underneath it wasn't what I'd hoped. That's on me, partly. I can hold that. What I can't do is pretend the choice they made didn't tell me something true about where things stood. The decision I made, to change the will, to sell the house, to redirect what I'd built towards something that would last, wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. Because I think it's easy to hear a story like this and see it as a score being settled. It wasn't. It was something quieter. It was me, finally, deciding that my life and what I leave behind should reflect my actual values. Sandra's name is on a wall in a children's library now. That room will be there long after I'm gone, and children who have never heard of me or her will sit in small chairs and open books and not know that the woman who loved reading more than almost anything made that room possible. That matters to me more than I can say. What I hope, if I'm being honest, is that Kevin opens that toolbox someday. Not to sell it, not to inventory it, but to actually pick up one of those tools and build something, fix something, feel in his hands what it means to make something work. My father used those tools his whole life. I used them too on the house, on the back steps, on all the small repairs that keep a life from falling apart. There's a kind of intelligence that only comes from that. From doing the hard, unglamorous physical work of maintaining something you care about. I hope Kevin finds it, and I hope Tanya, when she looks at her mother's photograph, Sandra in that yellow sundress, laughing at something just out of frame, I hope she asks herself what her mother was laughing at. I hope she wonders. I hope she wonders. I hope the wondering leads her somewhere good. I don't know if either of them will come around. I don't know if I'll let them in if they do. What I know is that I'm not sitting here waiting to find out. I'm sitting by a window facing east, drinking my coffee, watching the light come up over the park. I'm doing my exercises. I'm getting stronger. A life that nearly ended on cold concrete steps turned into something I didn't expect. Something with more room in it, more quiet, more intention than anything I'd had in years. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing to walk away from a hard season carrying. That's everything, actually.